Hey, Sally, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here and I'm unmuted.
Okay, cool. Thanks for doing it.
I started to get nervous that when I was in the waiting room.
Oh, yeah, I was taking care of some other stuff here and it's like, oh my gosh, it's time.
I do have a PowerPoint if we can share host.
Okay, to go back and remember how to do that. Okay, you should be a co-host now.
Okay. Yeah, I can share. Good. Okay.
Okay, just give it a few minutes here while people are joining us.
No problem.
Are you teaching during the summer, Sally?
I'm not teaching, but since I'm in clinic, I'm supervising cases and keeping the cases going. So I have one student to just keep on top of the 30 cases that are still open from the spring.
Oh, boy. Okay, it's 5:30 and I'm sure we'll have people joining us as we go here. And we'll let them in, but I just want to introduce everyone to Sally Frank. Sally is a law professor at Drake University in Des Moines, and she has very graciously accepted our invitation to speak to us about protester rights. I think many of you in the audience know what happened here in Cedar Rapids a few weeks ago. We had the day the Supreme Court released their decision on abortion, we had sort of a rapid response rally. And at the end of the rally, some of the group decided they wanted to do a march around downtown. And as they were returning to the parking lot where we had started, there was a truck that came through a crosswalk and injured a couple of the people. So my understanding, just based on what was in the paper in the last day or two, the Cedar Rapids police have finished their investigation of the incident. They would typically refer it to the Lynn County attorney, but the Lynn County attorney was actually present at the rally. So it's been referred to the Blackhawk County attorney. So I don't know the legal process, but I'm assuming now the Blackhawk County attorney looks at it to see if there is evidence for further action. And maybe Sally, at some point you can address what that process would look like. But that I think drew attention to the fact that with a lot of rallies and protests and marches popping up in response to the Roe decision, we thought it would be worthwhile to make sure that all of us understood our rights and responsibilities as we participate in those for our own protection, for the protection of the people around us. I don't think any of us that participate in these have set out, with any intention to break a law or cause any sort of trouble. We just want our voices to be heard, and we want to exercise our First Amendment rights. So that's sort of how we got here. And like I said, we really appreciate Sally being willing to spend some time with us. Sally's got a presentation here, and I think at the end, we'll allow some time for some questions. So if there's something that comes up while you're listening, make yourself a note or a mental note, and we will address that in a few minutes. So thanks to all of you out there in Zoom land for coming. We are recording this. There are some folks who wanted to be here, but like always, there are too many things happening. So we're recording it for them to look at later. So Sally, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Okay, well, I have a screen PowerPoint. So I'd have to warn you, my PowerPoint is not the best. I'm not the most skilled at PowerPoint, so I don't have great animations or anything, but hopefully this will be helpful to you. What I'm going to talk about is both your individual encounters outside of the area of a protest, as well as protest rights. And whenever I talk about people's rights, especially with the police, I have to acknowledge that some of this is easy for me to say because I have white privilege, and I might have more safety in telling police that I'm not going to answer their questions and I'm not going to let them search my car. I'm not going to consent to a search and things like that than a person of color might have. And so this is about your rights, but the most important thing, of course, is to stay safe. And if you're in a situation where your safety could be impaired by not consenting or things like that, then that obviously safety comes first. So I want to acknowledge that up front, because I'm going to be talking about ways, the things you do if you actually exercise your rights are annoying to the police. And so you've got to weigh those things in your own decisions of how to approach things. And I'm doing it from a very strong rights perspective, but I recognize that that's an issue that has to be considered. So what I'm going to talk about generally is first the police encounter. Oh, wait a minute. One other proviso, I'm sorry, is also that while certain things are our rights, when you're on the street and there's a police officer, the person who's adjudicating at that moment what your rights are is the police officer. So if they tell you stand here and you don't want to stand here and they want to arrest you for it, what's going to happen is you're going to spend the night in jail and then going to be able to argue for your rights to a judge. So just always keep that in mind. They're the ones with all of the equipment, all of the force, and we have just ourselves. And so they may not acknowledge your rights. So that's the other thing, that we have them, but whether that gets there or not is another question. So as I said, what I'm first going to discuss is, in a general encounter with the police, not outside of a protest, considerations for organizers when they're preparing for a protest, and participants in protest preparation and rights. And some of this I'm going to talk about and kind of out of what's happened in the last year, and I don't want that to scare anyone from protesting. Some of the powers that be want to scare us out of protesting. This is not meant to scare you, but it is just in extreme, if potentially extreme things happen, also what you need to do or can or can't do and things like that. So the first thing is, and we all know this, but we don't always do it, is we have the right to remain silent. Police are trained in interrogation. Police are trained to be friendly and just get somebody to talk. Any encounter with the police is talking to the police, and you want to be very careful if that happens. You might not even realize you're being interrogated. If the police ask you a question, and I'm going to say this often, I want this to become your mantra. Make it a mantra. Practice it in your head. that I'm exercising my right to remain silent and will not answer any questions without the presence of my attorney. So you're invoking your Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. You do not have to answer police questions. Practice it ahead, think about it, and be ready to say it, because it's really surprisingly hard to do it. And the last thing in this section, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why it's hard to do it. But just, I'm exercising my right to remain silent. I will not answer any questions without the presence of my attorney. So what about if you have a traffic stop and you're driving? The driver must show license, registration, and proof of insurance. The passenger doesn't have to show anything. The passenger does not have to show ID. The passenger doesn't have to even give their name, though the police do not know that. The police will threaten people if they don't give their names to the police, that they'll arrest them for interference. It is not interference. There are a couple of people in the waiting room. It's not interference, but again, that's one of those things where then the police may arrest, and are you really going to, where is that going to be decided? Neither the driver nor the passenger are required to answer any questions. The police might ask you things like, so where are you heading? Or do you know why I stopped you? If you answer the question, do you know why I stopped you? And you say, oh, because I was speeding, you've just admitted to speeding, So my approach would be either to say no, because even if I knew I was speeding, I don't know if that's the reason the police officer stopped me. I have no idea what's in the police officer's head. So it would be honest to say no. Or just, sorry, I'm not going to answer any questions. I'm exercising my right to remain silent, and will not answer any questions without my attorney. It's hard to do that in a traffic stop. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have had traffic stops, and you want to get done with it as quickly as possible and move on your way. And refusing to answer questions, of course, is not going to get it done quickly. But it is your right, and it's just amazing how much they can get out of someone. And when you stop answering questions is hard, so you might want to just from the start. The passenger doesn't have to answer any questions. The common police interrogation method is once they've stopped a car, they get the passenger out, they ask the passenger where they're going, what they're doing, they ask the driver, they look for inconsistencies. It's a real interrogation. So use the mantra. And we keep repeating that. Use the mantra. I'm not going to answer. I refuse to answer any questions without my attorney present. I'm exercising my right not to answer any questions without my attorney present. A street encounter, the police can do a stop and frisk. Of course, mostly they do that to people of color, much more than to white people. But if you're stopped, the first thing to ask is if you are free to leave. So you're stopped and they ask you a question. Well, hey, what are you doing? What are you up to these days? What are you doing out here? First question is, am I free to leave? If the answer is yes, leave. If the answer is no, say, I'm not going to answer any questions without my attorney present. I'm exercising my right not to answer any questions without my attorney present. Now, the police may say, oh, but we're not detaining you. This isn't, you're not under arrest. You don't need to say that. You need to know, first of all, it doesn't matter under any circumstance. You don't have to answer the police questions. So it doesn't matter. They may not have to tell you that, but you still have the right to refuse to answer, even if you're not under arrest. And if they say, but we're not detaining you, you can then say, so am I free to leave? Well, no, you're not free to leave. See, they're detaining you. So because you don't want to walk away if you're in detention, because then you're interfering with the police or resisting arrest or things like that. So you want to clarify, but you can keep repeating that you're not going to answer questions. And don't believe that they're going to end the encounter quicker if you start answering, because once you've asked one question, they'll have another and another and another. Whereas if you just won't answer any questions, their choice is either arrest you, but they have to have a reason to arrest you, or release you and say you're free to go. So it's actually, in that circumstance, probably faster to say, I'm not going to answer. If you're arrested, and I'm going to get back into some of this when we when I talk about protests. But so if you're actually arrested, a lot of people will say, especially at protest arrests, you know, they didn't read me my Miranda rights. We're so used to every police show we watch, there's the Miranda rights. It's only if they plan to interrogate you, and just don't wait for Miranda, don't expect it. There are certain questions you should answer if you're arrested. Your name, your address, your employment, date of birth, social security number. If you want to get released and you don't answer any of those questions, you're not a good bail risk. You know, Jane Doe of an unknown address, of an unknown employment status, unknown community ties, what's the likelihood that a police officer, you know, that they're gonna set a decent, let you out on bail or even release you that night? So they, you know, it's up to you. If a lot of people want to be John and Jane Doe, you can, but you're going to get held. So you might, you know, those kinds of things are called pedigree questions. And generally those should be answered unless as part of your protest, you want to be a John or Jane Doe. I understand also a lot of the jails, if you're actually booked into the jail, ask if you're suicidal. And at least in Polk County, if you refuse to answer that question, then they like put you in an anti-suicide cell and give you no clothes and like a paper thing to wear. It's really horrible. So if you're not suicidal, you probably want to answer that you're not suicidal. But anything else, what brought you to the protest, or anything else personal about you or people you know, go back to your mantra. I'm not going to answer any questions. I'm exercising my right to remain silent without the presence of my attorney. And know that you're being taped all the time. And there may be a plainclothes or undercover officer in the holding cell who's going to try to get to know you and ask you questions. Even somebody who isn't an officer might think, well, they're going to give the information you said to the police. You're being taped. Anything you do or say can be used. The phone is being taped. So, you know, let's say you're picked up on an OWI and you call your spouse and say, you know, can you bail me out? I was out drunk driving. Okay, you just admitted that you were drunk driving in something we can use against you at trial. Now they're not supposed to record if it's to your attorney, but it's just be really careful what you say, even to other people. People have a tendency to want to tell their story. And remember that if you tell your story, the person you tell it to, unless if you do it from the jail, it's taped. And if you do it in any other circumstance, unless it's a clergy person, a spouse, a lawyer, you can be subpoenaed. So, you know, even your kid, you can be subpoenaed to testify against your kid. There is no parent-child privilege. So be careful when you're interrogating your kid about all the details of what happened, because you could end up subpoenaed. So not that any of your kids would do anything, but you know, be careful about those issues, because privileges are fairly limited. And once it's said, it can be subpoenaed if it's not privileged. So why don't you want to talk? You know, that's often the police will say, well, why won't you talk to me? I just want to know X. They can lie to you. They might say, you know, you'll get out earlier, or it'll go easier on you if you just talk, or that's a lie. It's actually going to go much worse for you if you talk, because then they have more evidence against you. Remember that lying to the police is a crime. Once you start answering questions, then they ask something super intrusive and you become flippant, it's a crime. Or when they, you know, if they stop you and they ask your name, well, you're under no obligation to give a name. If you're in an obnoxious mood and you say, I'm Kim Reynolds or Donald Trump, you've just lied to the police and are subject to arrest. And at least those names they're going to know and know you're not them. So better not to answer. And, you know, we all sometimes have that little bit of obnoxious streak in us, but that's not the place to do it. Lying to the police is a crime. And also sometimes an honest answer can be incriminating, even though you don't know it is. Like they say, well, where were you at noon on Tuesday of this week? And you say, oh, I was out at this restaurant eating lunch. Well, it turns out there was a robbery next door to the restaurant, and you've just placed yourself in the vicinity at the time of the robbery. You don't know that, you don't realize it, but that's completely, what to you was completely innocent statement can be used against you in a way you can't even anticipate. So it's not like just guilty conscience, don't talk. You never know how what you say can be used and what they're looking for. And that's why the best policy is not to talk. It also could put others in danger. They might start asking you, well, who else was planning that rally and who were you with? And all of that, that can just add things. So if this is all the danger, why is it so hard not to answer questions? I think the first thing is it's impolite. You know, we've all been trained to be polite to people, especially to authority figures. And if somebody asks you a question, your normal instinct, my normal instinct is to answer the question, because that's the nice, polite thing to do. But you need to like get past that and say, no, I'm not going to answer the question. This happens with my students too. Think of a new lawyer and you have to make an objection during testimony, and we've all been taught not to interrupt, and suddenly you have to interrupt and say, I object. It's hard because we have to get past our training of politeness. And police will use that instinct to be polite. They'll make you feel guilty if you don't answer. Many people think they can talk their way out of a ticket or out of an arrest, and they end up adding to what can happen, adding to the charge, adding to the evidence against them. Also, the police can lie to people to get them to talk. I think there are some limits in Iowa about whether they can say, I won't prosecute you if, but short of something like that, they can lie and say, well, we have all the evidence, just admit it, or all kinds of things that get people to talk. And when you look at exonerations in capital cases, murder cases, you often find that somebody, you know, had been interrogated for hours and hours and hours. And then, you know, finally they say, look, this will end if you just admit it, and they admit it. And then they're found guilty, and, you know, so you want to just be careful with that. And in theory, again, no guarantee that police will obey it, but the rules are that if you say, I'm not going to answer any question, the mantra, if you say I'm exercising my right to remain silent, won't answer any questions without a lawyer, they're supposed to immediately stop questioning you. And of course, we see in the TV shows when they start talking to each other to try to get the person to then start talking. But, you know, just keep saying, if you keep saying that, that could cut short the interrogation and not have you being interrogated all night or things like that. So just keep that your way. And then the other thing is some people are just talkers, and for that, I just have I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint for a minute. I didn't know how to embed the video into it, but there's a scene from Shrek 3 actually, and that I think really illustrates some of the concept. And when I saw it, I thought every criminal defense attorney in the country was probably falling over themselves laughing. So let me just go back to share screen and get a different screen. Just, oops, sorry, this is the not expert at, okay, now I can go back, share screen. Okay.
Donkey, you have the right to remain silent. What you lack is the capacity. I must
The defense attorney in me loved that line. It's because that's the talker, right? We want to talk, we have the right. We just often don't have the capacity to remain silent. So work on yourself, practice the mantra so that you'll keep doing it. You'll keep not talking. Then the question is searches. Police don't always tell you you have the right to say no. They'll say, so can I search your car? Well, no, why? What do you have to hide? Well, you don't need to have anything to hide to say, no, you're not going to consent to the search. They may say, well, we'll just get a search warrant then. And I see that a lot on the movies and TV shows, but we'll just get a search warrant. Then my response would be, fine, get a search warrant. Then if you show me a search warrant, then I'll let you in to search, but I'm not consenting. So what you want to say is you want to say often, and you want to say out loud. And if it's in a public area, you want it loud enough for other people to hear. I do not consent to a search. I don't consent to a search of me. I don't consent to a search of my car. I don't consent to a search of my home. I don't consent to a search of my purse or my backpack, whatever it is. I do not consent to a search. Now, police do have a right to pat and frisk if they have a reasonable suspicion, stop and frisk, which is patting down just the outside, if they have a reasonable suspicion that you're engaged in illegal conduct, but only if they have a reasonable suspicion. So the next thing, though, is while you want to publicly say you do not consent, do not interfere. So, don't try to get in front of your car and not let them in the car. If they want to stop and frisk you, or they want to search your bag, the bag back from them. Say, I don't consent to the search. I will not interfere with you, because there's a charge of interference with official acts. And, while it has to be something lawful, you could still get charged with it if you're trying to interfere. So you want to make your rights known, make your position known. Don't let the police talk you into agreeing to it, but don't interfere, do anything to try to prevent them from searching. So that's kind of the overall with search, and it's in every area. And as I say, if they get a search warrant, then, look at it. They have a right to search if they get a search warrant. If they get a subpoena or a search warrant for your phone, they have a right to your phone. You do not have to give them your password on your phone. They would need, my position during the BLM in 2020, there was an FBI agent pressing people for their passwords, and they called me, and I asked the guy if he had a court order specifically ordering any one of those individuals to give the password to him. And he had to slowly admit, no, he didn't, because he's like, well, I have this warrant for the phone. It's like, yes, they have to give you the phone. Do you have an order signed by a judge that says Jane Doe must give you her password to her phone? No. So I then told him, you don't have to give it to them if you don't want to. I have a long, hard to decode password on my phone, because I know they can unencrypt, they can get to some things, but not everything. So, no, and if you have an Android phone, I think you have to specifically put make it password protected. If you have an Apple phone, then it is automatically password protected. You'd have to take that off. Don't take it off. And you do want, what if you're at a party or something, you put your phone down, you don't want other people searching your phone. So you always want to password protect it anyway. And if you're using encryption material like Signal, a lot of activists use Signal for planning and protest. And the positive of something like Signal is it's end-to-end encrypted, and the company doesn't keep anything that goes through its way. So if it got a subpoena for its records, it wouldn't have the records of what people wrote, which is stronger than Google Maps, or any of the Google's products. They keep it and it can be subpoenaed. So this, if you end up having to wanting to help people, if Iowa makes abortion illegal and you end up helping people crossing state lines, you might want to put that stuff on, do that through Signal, but make sure you also auto delete Signal. Don't, it's end-to-end encryption, but if they get your phone and it's still sitting on your phone, all the information, then it hasn't helped much. So, have some time where automatically your messages are deleted from Signal so that they don't get it. Because if it's sitting on your phone, then they can still get it. So think about that. See exactly what the search warrant gives them the right to search, and then they have a right to search it. But it's got to be a search warrant from a judge, not some general authorization from ICE or something like that. Now getting to protests. In 2021, the legislature retaliated against Black Lives Matter by trying to make it illegal to protest. Really horrible laws. And they've now made it a serious misdemeanor if you block traffic or block the street. And it used to be a simple misdemeanor, which is simple is maximum 30 days, serious is a year, aggravated is 2 years. They also made it aggravated misdemeanor if you're block the streets, if it's basically a highway, or if it's during an what they've called an unlawful assembly. They've also made it an aggravated misdemeanor, and this is an interesting one. Interference with public disorder control. Any person who possesses a tool, instrument, or device with the intent to suppress or disrupt law enforcement from legally deploying a device to control public disorder is an aggravated misdemeanor. I don't know if that's a gas mask. I don't know if that's from Portland when people brought, like tennis rackets, and when the explosive devices came into the crowd, they shot them back, they tossed them back, or I'm not sure what that is, but it's pretty ridiculous. And then you've got what you were talking about in the beginning, the issue of drivers. And this is the statute that gives civil immunity to certain drivers who hit protesters. If people are blocking traffic or a highway, or engaging in disorderly conduct or unlawful assembly or a riot, or participating in a protest or demonstration, which is kind of interesting. They say they can't be reckless, but, and that if you have a valid permit, then that's different. So the law is kind of problematic. And if you're not blocking the highway, my understanding in the Cedar Rapids case is they were crossing with the light. So, an individual or a group of people crossing with the light is not blocking traffic or anything. And that's why it might be able to get around the statute. These laws are just to intimidate and scare people from protesting, and they're absolutely horrendous. They also increased riot penalties and made definition of a riot much broader. A whole bunch of things that are problematic. So if you're organizing a protest, one of the things to consider is whether or not you want a permit. Obviously, if you have a permit that allows you to block the streets, then you're not committing disorderly conduct blocking the streets. Or if you're going to have a large crowd, then things like that, then you might want to apply for a permit. I know there are some organizations, the Black Liberation Movement in Des Moines does not believe in permits. They never get permits for protests. So I just know that. If you're denied a permit when you've applied for it, you can go to civil liberties organizations. You might want to contact the ACLU or a First Amendment lawyer in the Iowa City area, Cedar Rapids area, whatever. You want to check the rules. There are sometimes how many days ahead you need to request a permit. That can be changed if there's an emergency, like, the Supreme Court decided today and therefore we're protesting today. There's also sometimes costs, but they can't make the cost so high that they prevent First Amendment activity. There's some good case law on that. You might also, you want to look at local law, municipal law, on whether or not you need permits for sound amplification devices and what the rules are for getting that. If you're not going to block the street or block the sidewalk and you're in a public place, you do not need a permit. So if any public street, well, sidewalk, any public sidewalk, public park, anything like that, you do not need a permit if you're not going to block the street or the sidewalk. You have to make sure there's room for people to walk. So any kind of public traditional space for public speech, like streets, parks, etc., or sidewalks, parks, you don't need it. Just as an aside, know that there is no right to protest on a military base, so it might be a public sidewalk inside a military base. They're going to ban you. Also, a mall. You can be at the entrance to the mall and the public street that's the entrance to the mall, but in the parking lot of the mall, or the sidewalk between the parking lot and the mall buildings are all owned by the mall, and therefore it's private property and you don't have a right to protest in the private property. I took it to the Iowa Supreme Court. Somehow they've followed all the Midwestern states and not New Jersey and California. Figured it was worth a shot, but I lost that one. So now, of course, what can happen is you can start and just wait for them to kick you out. So you can have the sign on the sidewalk, and then when the security says you have to get rid of the sign, then you have to, or leave, then you have to get rid of the sign or leave. So it's not like you'd be arrested the instant you unfurl the sign, but if you refuse to leave or stop protesting once they tell you to, then it's trespass. So whether or not to get a permit obviously is something organizers have to think about, and decide what kind of route they want, what kind of action they want, and whether or not they want to request a permit. Couple other things to think about from organizers. It's always good to get medics at the protest and legal observers. And there are some guild members that we have been trained for legal observing in the Iowa City area, though I don't offhand know their names, but so you can contact them ahead. And the medics, even if you're not planning anything that should be a problem, what if somebody gets overheated because it's 90 degrees out and starts to pass out? It would be nice if there's a medic on site until you can get EMS, EMTs over to them. If you have a medic who can help them right away, that would be nice. Or somebody falls and sprains an ankle. So it's not only for police encounters and how to deal with tear gas or macing or things like that. There's just normal, get a crowd of people together, the odds that somebody might have a problem, they know CPR, they know other things. If, there's a chance someone could have a problem, and it's really nice to have somebody with the group who can hurry over and help. So medics are useful even in a very low key, no problem area type of protest, just as you've got a group. And if you're going to have a walk or a march, then somebody can trip on something and fall. So those kinds of things. So, and usually there are groups of medics that are willing to do that and volunteer, and the Lawyers Guild is willing to volunteer to watch the police. And hopefully nothing's happening if you're not planning for anything to happen, but it's still a useful thing. Now, protester prep and on site, and I used the wrong site there. Sorry about that. I just looked and I have citation. No. Okay. Obviously, wear comfortable shoes. Make sure you do not have anything illegal on you. Certainly before civil disobedience actions, I suggest people look through their pockets for any old whatever. There might be an old joint somewhere. years ago, there was a planned civil disobedience action, and one of the organizers, when he was arrested, it turned out had marijuana on him. It's like we were all, how could you have not known to get rid of that and not have it on you when you planned to risk arrest? People were very annoyed. I'm frustrated. But so, look through your pockets, look through if you're carrying something, just make sure you don't have anything that you then get in trouble if you if you were arrested. And if you need prescription medication, have it in the prescription container. Sometimes I forget, but I have asthma, I have an inhaler, and I will sometimes bring the piece of the box that shows I have a prescription for the inhaler. I also have migraines, and that I make sure the medication, I have it in a container that has my prescription on it. So I don't get, because that's sometimes they're not as worried about inhalers as other things. So, if you need to carry something with you, have it in the prescription container so you're not going to get stopped and get a drug charge that would later be dismissed because you're sure you had a right to carry it, but it's going to be longer to get out of jail in order for you to be able to do that. Take off the facial recognition, the fingerprint to open the phone. Police can force your fingerprint on it or hold the phone in front of you. So you want to take that off the phone. So you have to only open it by password. Of course, that's a pain in the neck. I recognize it, especially because I have a long password that it's a pain in the neck to keep opening it, but it's safer. You might also want to take location services off. Think twice about live streaming. Live streaming is a dual-edged sword, and so, to some extent, you want to announce and have people see what the protest is. And if there's police encounters, you want to show people what the police are doing, but the police will then go through that live stream and look at it for evidence and then may arrest people from it. So that might be something organizers want to think about. But if you're planning it totally legal and don't expect any problems, protest, and then there are problems, you might want to be really careful about live streaming when the problems break out. You might want to tape it and then look at it later and look at it with a defense attorney as to whether this incriminates anybody, while at the same time is this good defense evidence or not? But putting it up, the police do study those things. The police look at it. And don't bring valuable things to a protest, although I do wear my necklace that has things, but if something happens and you might lose it. So that's your prep, and obviously bring water if it's on hot days. Or one thing, and this isn't so much your rights, but a practical thing. Many years ago to protest in DC, it was over 90 degrees and I had water, but I finished it. I was starting to feel faint, and somebody had a bottle of water that they had put in the freezer the night before. So all day they were getting cold water through it because the ice was melting, and it was really, I've used that since. It's very helpful. So especially if it's going to be a long rally with a dozen speakers or more, and it's going to take time. If you let that ice melt while you're there, you're going to have cold water for longer and not just hot water because it's 90 degrees out. When you're at the protest, listen for police orders. So if the police do give an order to disperse or an order to get out of the street or any of those orders, you'll be making an informed decision on whether or not you want to obey it. The lawyer in me requires me to say that, I recommend that you obey any police orders, but at least you want to make an informed choice. So if you hear an order, then you can decide what's more important. I disagree with them that I think I have a right to protest here, and they're telling me I don't have a right to protest here. Well, the only way that's going to be resolved, it's not going to be resolved on the street at that moment. You can either obey the order or you can argue it to a judge after they've arrested you that order was illegal. So just keep an eye out for that. Listen, watch for police kettling. That's kettling, not kittling. I was really working on this late. Kettling is a tactic. I've only seen it in Des Moines in one Black Lives Matter protest. I've seen it in other cities, especially around political conventions, where basically police completely surround the group, then order them to leave, but don't give them a way to leave, and then arrest everyone who's within the circle. Whether the person came out of their house to walk the dog, left a restaurant and ended up in the middle of the circle, or was actually doing something that was worthy of being, may have been worthy of being arrested. If they're police, you want to watch the police. I, as a legal observer, do that a lot. And when I did Kettle in Des Moines, I was watching, could see it forming, and stayed and kept my other legal observer who was with me behind the police, so that when they encircled everybody, we weren't in the circle. But it's a very illegal, unconstitutional practice. But then again, they don't worry about paying a judgment 5 years from now or 10 years from now, when they can just get people off the street and punish them by putting them in jail for a while anyway. My general, while you might have a right to argue with counter protesters, you do have a right to argue with counter protesters. Generally, it is not a very helpful thing to do. Then you both get more and more heated, and and violence can result. It's best really not to engage with the counter protesters and raise your blood pressure, and you're going to get angrier. So they're trying to create an incident when they counter protest, and why give them that pleasure? Especially if there's a chance of trouble. Right, the bail fund, if there's a bail fund in the area, and I know in Iowa, I think there's the same bail fund for Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, you write the phone number and with a marker that's not erasable on your arm. It'll erase over time. But you might get, before you get a phone call, you might be searched, you might be put in jail clothes, and you may be very upset. How are you going to remember the number to call? If it's written on your arm, they can't take that away from you. They can't take your arm away from you. So they might take a piece of paper, but they're not going to take your arm. So frequently at protests, people will write the name of the bail fund on their arm. Or if you have somebody outside, if you know this is a risky protest, you have an outside support person, put that person's phone number. You might think you remember it, but it's probably mostly on your telephone. You type the person's name and the number comes up, and that's how you call people. How many phone numbers this day and age do we actually really remember? And if you're nervous and upset, are you going to remember that number? So write the phone number and then, on your arm, so that you have it if you need to make a phone call. Hopefully then you just wash it off the next morning and you haven't needed it, but it's a helpful thing to do. And that often starts at some protests, especially more confrontational protests, where there's more chance of difficulty. You can also have your outside support person, if you are arrested, or if you think there could be an arrest, an outside support person can be a good thing, or sometimes the organizations, jail support people. It's useful to have them. They can be aware of your prescriptions and maybe be able to help get a jail to know that, yes, you have these prescriptions, maybe take photos of them and have the person have them so they know your prescriptions. If you're going to be held overnight, you want somebody to be able to call the employer and give some reason why you're not at work that day. Probably not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but can't come in as, or whatever. You want someone to call so you're not just a no-show advocate. So things like that just keep your life in order. If you have kids, who's going to take care of the kid if I'm arrested, things like that. Again, don't answer police questions, the same thing. Call a bail fund. And don't try to resist arrest. That, if you think they're unjustly arresting you, they could be wrong and you could be completely not guilty of whatever the primary charge is, but there you are trying to squirm out of it or run away from pull your arm away. and suddenly you are guilty of interference, even if you weren't guilty of what they were arresting you for in the first place. So, and I know there've been discussions about de-arresting people. That's interference and might end up also with some assaults and things, because how to de-arrest, it's not a safe idea. If you witness someone else getting arrested, if there is a legal observer at the protest, give as much information as you can to the legal observer. Sometimes you're at a protest, you don't know the person standing next to you. You know, you're wandering around. But if you can tell the legal observer your name, your phone number, and what you saw, the legal observer can get that to a defense attorney. And then the defense attorney, because if you don't know the person arrested, they don't know you, and they don't know who their defense witnesses are. Now, you may or may not be a defense witness. They may have done exactly what they're charged with, in which case the defense attorney won't use you as a witness, but they may not be they may not have done whatever they're charged with, and you could be an important witness. And that's one of the things legal observers do, is try to get witness statements and information. If you do know the person who was arrested, you know, the lawyer might be able to go to them at where they're being held and talk to them and get information to the bail fund and stuff. So do let the legal observer, bail fund, jail support know. If if your friend was arrested next to you and you know there's a bail fund, call the bail fund. You know, basically in Des Moines 2020 protests, after the first night, pretty much everybody got bailed out, even when the police ridiculously overcharged. And the bail fund was able to get people out without having to spend the night in jail. So, but it helps them if they know who they're trying to bail out. They have to have a name. It doesn't really work well if they don't know who it is. Okay. So, and then if there isn't a legal observer in town, but you know the person, ask who their lawyer is and try to get information to the lawyer so that you witnessed it, what you witnessed. And again, the lawyer will make a decision about whether they want you as a witness, and you might not be a helpful witness. So you're not telling the police, you're not telling the prosecutor, you're telling the defense attorney, and they'll make a decision of whether or not to use you. There are special concerns about more risky protests and arrests if you are not a US citizen. You really have to think about it, because it's amazing how many things, even if documented, how many things can cause you to be open to deportation. It's really horrendous. So, if you're not a citizen, there are extra things to consider and be aware of. Obviously, if you're undocumented, that is a problem. But one of the things people are not required to do is, if the police ask your immigration status, people don't have to answer. And I really encourage people who are citizens not to answer the question as well. So if the only people not answering are the immigrants, then it's easier for police. So I'd encourage those of you who are citizens not to answer the question either. So immigration status, immigrants, if you're under 18, you might want a parent available for release, or if the parents are going to be participating as well, they might want somebody offsite with a letter saying that the minor should be released to them, so that the minor can get released quicker. In Iowa, a minor can get released more easily and quickly than an adult on the kinds of things that happen at protests. So if you're on parole or probation, you really want to consider and think about the risks, because an arrest or a charge can be a violation of parole or probation. And obviously, if you have a long list of arrests, the chances of a more serious penalty come up, not within the maximum, but, so a simple misdemeanor maximum sentence is 30 days. Most people are going to get a fine, but if it's your 50th simple misdemeanor, they may decide to give you jail time. So things like that. And then I'm going to copy this also into the chat, just, but there are several Know Your Rights pamphlets available. And a lot of what I told, I've reread yesterday, the National Lawyers Guild Know Your Rights booklet, and I've got the web link here, so I'll put it into the chat also. Once I leave sharing, I think I'll be able to. So the ACLU also has Know Your Rights material on its website. So they're good places to read up more. And then the final thing I want to say to you is, don't let any of this scare you. Keep protesting. We've certainly got a lot we need to protest. There's a lot of things that are wrong. And so please keep it up. Don't let anything I said scare you out of it. And here's the link in the chat. So I probably went on too long, but I'm happy to answer questions, even if we go a little beyond the hour scheduled.
Yeah,
So-
Sally, there's a question in the chat. How do you get trained as a legal observer?
Around here, I'm the one who does the training. I will, the last couple of years, I've done a joint one online for the student chapter of the Lawyers Guild at both Drake and University of Iowa. And so I'll try, if you email me, to remember to email you when I'm doing my next training. My email is sally.frank@drake.edu. And, you know, some local groups can look onto it. Generally, the Lawyers Guild is lawyers, legal workers, law students, and jailhouse attorneys. The jailhouse attorneys somehow never come to any conferences.
So
Vice
really, you should have a background in law in order to consider being trained as a legal observer.
Somewhat. It's not, you know, an activist can certainly do it. The key thing and this is a large, more emphasized in the legal observer training, but you have to make a choice on any protest. You can't be a protester and legal observer. So you have to choose your role. And last Sunday, I went to the big Des Moines Planned Parenthood organist and everybody else rally. And they didn't have legal observers. So it was the first time in a while where I actually chanted.
Yeah.
I got to chant because, you know, you got to observe, not participate if you're going to be a legal observer. So an activist can do it. And the legal observer sign, the Lawyers Guild, we have green hats that are very visible. They're kind of neon green, and they say National Lawyers Guild Legal Observer. They look weird, but in a large crowd, you can spot the green hats.
Right.
And if you look at some of the national protests, if you look at pictures of things, you'll see some of those green hats around. So that's the main thing we have. Some of the chapters have learned, you know, I'd love to be able to figure out how to do neon wool green hat for the winter, because they're more baseball hat. But okay, repeat my email.
Yeah.
Chat. Okay. Frank.
There were a couple things that you said that really like resonated for me. One of them was about the live streaming. You know, I think especially after the incident we had here in Cedar Rapids, you know, people were posting it on social media, the video. That seems to be like the first impulse when something happens. And I think maybe it is important to just take a step back and think about what you might be putting out there for the public to see, because we don't want to incriminate any of our own people. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. And I do also just want to mention, you mentioned the Signal, the messaging system that encrypts the messages, and not that we're hiding anything, but as you said, as we get further into this abortion situation, we don't know what's going to be legal and what's not going to be legal. And it is important to be careful about what you are saying on Facebook and Google, because yes, those things can come back find you. So,
And even, there've been discussions on, like, in the Gill, and there's jail support or whatever, keeping a document on, there's like Google Docs, but that is much more able to be gotten by the government, much more easier subpoenas than things than some others. I'm not a tech person to know all of which is better for which and things like that for high security, but Signal is what we use in legal observing. But if you use it again, remember to automatically erase so that, now it's like Snapchat, right? It automatically erases, except people take screenshots of it and then it's still there permanently. But so still remember somebody receiving it could still Snapchat it or, take a screenshot, but it's safer if it auto deletes. And at protests where they kettled, there was one legal observer arrested. And so while normally we had a 6-hour auto delete on our legal observer Signal chat, we immediately reduced it to 30 minutes because we knew he had it on his phone. And so I was like,
wow.
Move it down.
Yeah. Important things to think about that most of us, we get caught up in the moment, caught up in the protest or the march or whatever. And it's easy to let those things escape. Any other questions for Sally?
Well, and again, I hope I didn't scare you out of protest. I come from, in the worst case scenario, what do you need to do? Because, in a rally where everybody's sitting there and there's a few speeches and everyone goes home and it's fine, you don't really need to know your rights. So I approach it in the more tense kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you never know when you're going to need to know your rights. Like I said in the intro, I don't think any of us are intending to, break the law or do anything, but you just never know how things will work out. So it's always good information to have.
And one of the things I recommend to organizers is if they're going to do something that could be considered violating law, I prefer when the organizers let folks know that so they can get the jail support, so they can make the decision about, am I going to occupy the street or am I going to stay? Because, they don't have a permit and they're blocking traffic. Are the police going to arrest? Maybe, maybe not, whatever. But sometimes the people in the group don't all know that there isn't a permit. So I think it's better practice to announce it, although some groups don't. And, I'm not going to be announcing it for them or anything, but you want to think about who's going to be there. And I think it's better to have informed choice on whether you're going to do something or not. And that's why I was like, everybody should listen for police announcements. And then they're making an informed choice whether or not to obey them.
Sure. That makes sense. Okay. Well, thanks to all of you for being here with us, and a special thanks to you, Sally, for all this information. Even though Indivisible has been organizing things for a while, there were still things in here that I needed to think about as we continue to organize events. So I appreciate it. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us.
Well, thank you all for joining and